This is Akashvani. In the program Spotlight, now we bring you a discussion on charting a global course, historic New Delhi declaration, and path-breaking decisions at G20 Summit 2023. Participants are Anil Wadhwa, former ambassador, and Elizabeth Roche, anchor.
The 18th G20 Summit, which India was hosting, has concluded today, and a number of path-breaking proposals and recommendations have come out of the New Delhi joint communique. To discuss the importance and the significance of each of these developments, we have with us Anil Wadhwa, former Secretary East in the Ministry of External Affairs. Sir, welcome to this discussion.
Thank you.
So the G20 Summit has just gotten over. So what are your thoughts on how this event, which is the first that India has hosted on this magnitude and this scale, how has this event gone, do you think?
Well, I think the event has gone extremely well for India. And I think, in fact, the Indian presidency this time will go down as one of the most inclusive, vibrant, and goal-oriented summit which has ever taken place as far as G20 is concerned. It's actually helped in showcasing Indian push for development in particular and ensuring the ease of living through use of technology and also making sure that there is peace and prosperity in all parts of the world. So, told a very comprehensive leaders summit this time around.
So, if you look at it, there was one of the things that India had stressed was democratization. Now, whether we were talking about democratization or forms of multilateral organizations, or we were talking about taking this event, which was the G20, to all the people of our country, there was democratization in both terms. How do you look at this?
The G20 events, which are held in India over the past 9 to 10 months, have been held in 60 cities, and about 220 meetings were organized with 25,000 delegates from more than 115 countries across the world. And of course, it has, for the first time ever, seen the largest participation from the African continent. We also had 17 ministerials. There were 3 Sherpa events, about 70 working groups, and then there were a number of side events which were held as well. So there's been a pan-India coverage in the northeast, in Jammu and Kashmir, in central, western, eastern parts of India, and every state in India was sought to be covered. So it's been an event which has involved almost every state in India, plus universities. The student mobilization has been tremendous, and there is a people awareness. So that's why the Prime Minister has called it a People's G20 this time around. So deliverables which have come out are as important as the awareness that has happened about G20 within India.
So if we look at the deliverables or the takeaways, now I would like to sort of divide it into 2 parts. One is the takeaways, let's say, that accrue for India, because India is a middle power. It is trying to, this is one of the biggest events that it has hosted. It's burnished its credentials as a consensus builder, coming out with the New Delhi declaration, as it were. So how do you look at the takeaways for India out of this G20 summit?
So India's narrative this time around has been on using technology for governance. And there it has pushed for access to quality healthcare on an equitable basis. It's pushed for promotion of millets for food security and also the effect it has on the environment, reduction of land degradation, skilling of youth, the increased inclusive participation of the labor force, women's empowerment, and building of disaster resilient infrastructure. Those were the Indian thrusts in particular. But overall, I think the footprint, if you might call it that, on the G20 outcomes as far as India is concerned, there are at least 5 or 6 of them. One is the Deccan High-Level Principles on Food Security and Nutrition. Then there's the Chennai High-Level Principles for Blue Ocean Economy, the Goa Roadmap for Tourism, the Gandhinagar Implementation Roadmap for Land Restoration, Jaipur Call for Action to Enhance MSMEs and Access to Information, and the Delhi Summit inclusion of African Union as a permanent member of G20. So I think the highlight there was the green emphasis on Green Development Pact for a Sustainable Future, and also the technological transformation and digital public infrastructure, as well as reform of the multilateral institutions. where India has left a mark.
So, if we look at the takeaways for the global community, because G20 represents 19 of the most powerful economies of the world and the EU in that sense, but it is also representative of the world, isn't it? So, if you're looking at takeaways for the world from the summit, what would you say are the takeaways?
India actually pushed for an inclusive mechanism to this summit, which would actually help the global south, as we call it, as much as possible. And the question of human-centric approach, which India has been pushing for, and that includes resilient growth and development, which ensures welfare of citizens equitably. So I think it's in the economic outcomes that we can see something for the world in particular. And there we have the Green Development Pact, which I mentioned for sustainable future, because that is about reducing the burden that we would be passing on for future generations. So climate finance there was a big takeaway. So a climate finance mechanism which would ensure that developed countries can meet the $100 billion goal towards a new collective quantified goal beyond 2025, because that has not taken off in the past as far as the developing world is concerned. Then there was emphasis on faster progression of sustainability development goals. And that means that there has to be push for access to data from various countries in devising tailor-made solutions. And that was proposed in particular at this summit. In terms of the technological transformation and digital public infrastructure, I think what India has offered is the India stack to the world. So how can technology be used for minimum government and maximum governance and ensuring the deliverance of welfare to the last mile? Digital economy will help in creating new job opportunities and also uplifting people from multidimensional poverty. And cheap data, along with what India calls indigenously developed technology platforms, will help, like it has done in the case of India, for better development. Third aspect is the multilateral institutions for 21st century. Now, the first major issue here was the multilateral development institutions reforms. So there's been one expert group report which has been tabled. There's another report which is supposed to come out. And at Marrakesh, there would be also synthesis paper which will be debated on the crypto assets roadmap, for instance, how to govern cryptocurrencies. Then commitment of the G20 to common framework for debt treatment. That is something which has been an African demand for a very long period of time. The review of the IMF quota, which is not finished, but it's a work in progress. And also the fact that for the first time India has introduced the condemnation and countering of terrorism. Now, with that, some of the new mechanisms which have been discussed and which have found their way into the report are also very important. For example, the promotion of the startup ecosystem across the world, the use of alternate fuels to reduce dependency on fossil fuels, and discussion on alternate fuels such as hydrogen, ethanol blending, faster adoption of renewable energy to ensure sustainable growth to support energy demands of countries. And also the technological display to bring in transparency and accountability in governance. That's something which will be very important going forward for the global south. This will ensure that they have participation and delivery of welfare to the last mile. And while it is something which is extremely important for India itself, it's also something which will help the rest of the countries going forward.
So there was a lot of misgiving going into the summit as to whether there is going to be a Delhi declaration, a New Delhi G20 Summit declaration or not. There were questions being asked about the success of the summit given the absence of key leaders, the presidents of Russia and China. Given all that and given whatever has been achieved, would you say that the misgivings were entirely and totally misplaced?
I think there was apprehension more than misgiving. First of all, I think just because President Putin could not attend, that was in fact expected. But the fact that Xi Jinping was not present, but then we have the next in line leadership which was available from China. In fact, that ensured that there was nothing like disruption which was anticipated from the Chinese delegation at this summit. In fact, from all accounts, I think over the last 2 days, before the summit, and thereafter the Chinese delegation was trying to do its best to be part of the consensus. That also helped, by the way. This was the biggest apprehension, whether there would be the paragraphs on Ukraine war. Since yesterday, about how it was brought about, I think consensus was reached, in fact, one day before the summit was to end, which just goes to show that there was a desire on the part of all the G20 countries to reach a consensus. And that's what has finally been reflected in the document from between paragraphs 9 and 14.
So the other thing which I wanted to ask you about was the announcements which were made on the sidelines. So one was a Biofuel Alliance. Now, India has already, along with France, established the International Solar Alliance. We've also established the Disaster Resilient Infrastructure Partnership. So the Biofuel Alliance, how does that burnish our credentials for green energy and green growth, etc., that India is sort of making efforts on this front?
So I think the Global Biofuel Alliance was purely an Indian initiative. It started off with 19 core countries, but I'm sure it's going to gather steam as we go along in future, just as the International Solar Alliance and CDRI have become important all over the world. In fact, the Global Biofuel Alliance is designed to boost the use of cleaner fuels. And what it will do is accelerate global efforts to meet net zero emissions by facilitating trade in biofuels, which are derived from various sources, including plant and animal waste. And India has come up with new technologies in that regard, in fact, which is different from what has been done so far in countries like Brazil. Of course, it depends a lot on what kinds of resources you have and the pricing of those resources. But the fact that it's not based on fossil fuels and the fact that you're actually reducing dependence on fossil fuels through this initiative will be a big contributor to going forward to the environmental goals that the world has set for itself.
So the Prime Minister sort of at the end of the closing session, in fact, for the proposal for a virtual summit in November. How do you look at this proposal for a virtual summit? And it's unique in a way because this is probably about the second time in recent years that one country which holds the G20 presidency would have two summits. The earlier case probably is when Saudi Arabia called for an extraordinary summit, but that was against a backdrop of extraordinary events. The COVID-19 pandemic had just set in. So how do you look at this proposal by the Prime Minister for a virtual summit?
So I think there is some unfinished agenda which would not be considered at this physical summit which has just happened. And especially in the economic side, and I just talked to you about the cryptocurrency issue. That's one of the issues, but there are others, which is the common framework for debt treatment, for example. And of course, the MDB reforms, how to strengthen and evolve and raise the ambition of multilateral development banks. So we've so far had one expert group report, which is called Volume 1. And the second report, which will be called Volume 2, was supposed to have been discussed in Marrakesh later this year. Now, Morocco has had an earthquake, as you know, and that may or may not be held. Now, in the absence of that event, it would make sense to have some forum for discussion on these issues. They are at least complete in the sense that they've been discussed once, and the synthesis papers, which has been produced by the IMF and the FSB on crypto assets roadmap, at least that is discussed once. And then it's left to the leadership to decide whether to adopt it or to carry it forward to the next presidency, which is Brazil. So before Brazil takes over the presidency, these are major issues and that would be discussed. And any other business that has been left unfinished or halfway through would figure in that particular event.
So thank you very much for your time.
Thank you.
You were listening to a discussion on Charting a Global Course, Historic New Delhi Declaration and Path-Breaking Decisions at G20 Summit 2023. Participants were Anil Vadhva, former ambassador, and Elizabeth Roche, anchor. This program was produced and presented by the News Services Division of Akashvani. You can listen to it on our mobile app News on AIR. This program is also available on our YouTube channel, News on AIR Official. You may share your feedback about this program through email at airnsdtalks@gmail.com.
This is Delhi.